I gave this neighborhood everything, time, care, respect, only to have it trampled by power-hungry tyrants in the name of rules. They fined me, harassed me, and tried to destroy what I built. I watched my home turn into a battlefield, my peace shattered, my rights stripped away. And for what? Their greed. Their control. The people who should have protected this community turned against us. But they never expected me to fight back, and win. They deserved worse. I never set out to start a war. I'm just a guy who wants to be left alone, a man who enjoys a good steak on the grill, a cold beer on a Friday night, and the satisfaction of fixing things with my own two hands. My name is Fergus O'Malley, and for the past 8 years, I've called Willow Ridge Estates home. I bought this house for its big backyard, the quiet streets, and the idea that I'd finally found a place where I could live in peace. But peace was impossible with an HOA dictator running the show. Karen Whitmore, our self-appointed queen of neighborhood perfection, had turned Willow Ridge into her personal kingdom. If a flower pot wasn't within the approved color scheme, she'd issue a fine. If your Christmas lights stayed up one day too long, she'd threaten legal action. If your grass was half an inch too high, she'd measure it herself and send a violation notice. I tolerated her nonsense for years, playing by the rules to avoid trouble. But that was before she made it personal. Before she blocked my driveway with her SUV and declared war. And when someone declares war on me, I don't just fight back, I win. The first time I saw Karen's oversized SUV parked directly across my driveway, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe she was dropping something off, or maybe she just had one of her power trips and forgot that other people existed. But when I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and saw her standing on the sidewalk with her arms crossed and that smug, self-satisfied smirk, I knew, this was no accident. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Morning, Karen. Your car is blocking my driveway." "Oh, I know," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "It's HOA business. We've had complaints about your driveway." I blinked. Complaints? From who? She waved a perfectly manicured hand dismissively. "That information is confidential. But the board has decided that your driveway doesn't comply with HOA standards. Until we conduct a proper review, I'll need to keep my vehicle here, to prevent further infractions." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. "You're joking." "Nope," she chirped, pulling out a clipboard. "Oh, and just so you know, if you try to tow my car, that would be considered harassment. HOA rules." My jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. I wanted to argue, yell, do something, but I knew Karen. She thrived on confrontation. She wanted me to lose my temper so she could slap me with even more violations and fines. The next few days were hell. Every morning, I woke up to find her massive SUV still blocking my driveway. The HOA refused to help. When I called a tow company, they laughed and said they weren't allowed to intervene due to a vague community agreement. Meanwhile, Karen strutted around the neighborhood like she owned it, waving at me every time she saw me, like she had just won a grand prize. Then came the fines. Apparently, because I was neglecting driveway maintenance, which was impossible to use because her car was blocking it, I was now in violation. Every day, a new letter demanding payment arrived in my mailbox. I was furious. But I wasn't the kind of guy to roll over and take it. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was about to play smart. For the first few days, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that Karen would get bored and move on to some other poor homeowner who had committed the sin of choosing the wrong shade of beige for their shutters. But every morning, her SUV was still there, parked across my driveway like a monument to her ego. I called the HOA office. Voicemail. I sent emails. No response. I even stopped by the office in person, only for Karen's assistant to tell me Mrs. Westfield is very busy, and that I would need to submit my concerns in writing. I had already done that. Twice. Meanwhile, Karen acted like she had won the lottery. She would stroll past my house every afternoon, smiling like a cat who had just swallowed a canary, sipping her ridiculously overpriced coffee while my driveway sat unusable, my mailbox filled with fines. Then came the final straw. I came home one evening to find a violation notice taped to my door. A big, bold-lettered declaration that I was being fined $250 for failure to maintain driveway accessibility. I stood there in the fading sunlight, the paper crumpling in my tightening grip. Failure to maintain accessibility? I couldn't even use my damn driveway because Karen was parked in front of it. My blood boiled. I stormed across the street, fists clenched, fully prepared to let Karen have it. But as I reached her house, I froze. She was standing at her bay window, glass of wine in hand, watching me. And she was smiling. That was when it hit me, this was never about my driveway. This was a game to her. A power play. She was waiting for me to explode, waiting for me to lose my temper so she could turn it against me. I exhaled slowly, unclenching my fists. No. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, I turned around, went inside, and spent the rest of the night digging through zoning laws, property codes, and HOA regulations. If Karen wanted to weaponize the rules, I was going to find a way to turn them against her. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, my mind still racing from the night before. I had found something. A single line buried deep in the local zoning regulations, a loophole so perfect, so airtight, that it almost felt like fate. As long as it wasn't a permanent structure, I could legally build a security modification around my driveway. That meant barriers, reinforcements, even a trench, as long as I didn't make it a fixed installation. The gears in my head started turning. I pulled out a notepad and began sketching, my pencil scratching feverishly across the paper. If Karen wanted a battle, I was going to give her one. But I couldn't just start digging in broad daylight, not yet. Karen was always watching, and if she caught wind of what I was up to, she'd throw every trick in the book to stop me. So, I started slow. I spent the next 2 days gathering supplies, making quiet calls to some construction buddies who owed me favors. I rented an excavator, booked a team of workers, and triple-checked the legalities. Then, I waited. I watched Karen's patterns. She left every afternoon for exactly 2 hours, Pilates and brunch, like clockwork. That was my window. When the moment came, I pounced. As soon as her SUV disappeared down the road, I rolled the excavator onto my property. The workers arrived minutes later, shovels in hand, moving with surgical precision. Within an hour, the first deep trench was dug, right along the perimeter of my driveway. I glanced at my watch. 1 hour left. The pit widened. The dirt piled up. My pulse hammered in my chest. Finally, the rumble of an approaching SUV made my heart jolt. Karen was back early. I waved at my crew to wrap it up, sweat dripping down my back as the SUV turned onto the street. By the time she pulled into view, her mouth already twisting into a frown, I was standing casually by my half-dug trench, arms crossed, whistling like I hadn't just turned my driveway into a medieval moat. The look on her face. Priceless. The moment Karen's SUV rounded the corner, I saw her brake so hard her tires nearly screeched. Her face, visible even through the windshield, twisted in a mix of horror and rage as she took in the scene before her, a half-dug trench, mounds of fresh dirt, and a group of construction workers packing up their tools like they had just finished a masterpiece. She threw the car in park and practically launched herself out, stomping toward me so fast her designer heels sank into the loose soil. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked, gesturing wildly at the trench. I took my time answering, wiping the sweat from my brow and admiring my handiwork. "Oh, this?" I said, waving at the freshly dug hole like I was presenting an art piece. "Just a little security enhancement. HOA guidelines encourage property security, don't they? Karen's eye twitched so hard I thought she might combust. Security enhancement. Security enhancement. You dug a freaking moat around your driveway. Well, I said, pretending to consider, technically, it's not a moat. Not yet, anyway. She let out a frustrated screech, jabbing a manicured finger toward me. This is illegal. I will have the HOA issue fines so high you'll be paying them until retirement. I simply smiled, reaching into my back pocket and unfolding a neatly printed document. Actually, I said, relishing the moment, I checked the city zoning laws. Turns out, as long as it's not a permanent structure, I can build a temporary security modification. And this? I tapped my boot against the edge of the trench. This is temporary. Karen snatched the paper from my hand, scanning it quickly. Her face morphed from red-hot rage to pale, seething frustration as she realized I wasn't bluffing. Enjoy your day, Karen, I added with a wink before walking inside. As I closed the door, I heard her scream in pure frustration, followed by the unmistakable sound of her heels snapping as she stormed back to her SUV. The battle had begun. Karen thought she had me backed into a corner. She didn't realize I had already built my own exit. The next morning, a thick stack of violations was stuffed into my mailbox, courtesy of the HOA. $250 fine for unsightly modifications, $500 fine for hazardous construction. Another $100 per day until the trench was removed. The ink on these fines was still drying when Karen showed up in my driveway, arms crossed, her usual smirk back in place. You're going to be buried in fines, Fergus, she purred. That is, unless you remove this ridiculous mess and apologize to the board. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I casually reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a document thicker than her folder of violations. I let the silence stretch, watching her amusement fade as she eyed the papers. You think I haven't been busy, Karen? I said, letting my grin widen. See, you're right. There are rules in this neighborhood. And I found a few you forgot about. I handed her the stack, an official complaint to the city zoning board, a demand for a financial audit of the HOA, and a legal request for a neighborhood-wide vote on leadership positions. Karen's expression shattered in real time. This is nonsense. Oh, it's very real, I said. Turns out, residents have the legal right to challenge the HOA's leadership if they can prove misuse of power. And judging by the number of signatures I've gathered, I patted the folder. Your reign is looking a little shaky. Behind her, neighbors started gathering. Elaine, Michael, even Mr. Thompson, the people she had bullied for years, all stood behind me now. This is a joke, Karen spat. But I could see it, the first flicker of doubt, the realization that her power was slipping. No, Karen, I said, stepping closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. This is justice. And it's coming for you. For the first time, Karen had nothing to say. Karen was losing control, and she knew it. The cracks in her perfect little dictatorship were widening, and for the first time, she couldn't patch them up with a condescending smile and a clipboard full of fines. The real trouble for her started when the HOA board meeting took an unexpected turn. Karen, ever the drama queen, had called an emergency session, no doubt to try and squash my rebellion before it gained more ground. She walked in like a queen preparing to scold her unruly subjects. But this time, the subjects weren't having it. I arrived early, sitting in the back, watching as more neighbors than ever poured into the community center. They weren't here to support her, they were here to challenge her. People who had never spoken up before were suddenly furious about their own HOA horror stories, mysterious fines, selective enforcement, unexplained hikes in fees. Karen tapped her gavel, trying to regain control. We are here today to discuss the unauthorized. No, Elaine interrupted, standing up. We are here to discuss the HOA abusing its power. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Karen's smile stiffened. She wasn't used to being challenged. Then Michael Rodriguez, another neighbor she'd bullied, stepped forward. "We've all seen the report," he said, waving a folder. "We know about the missing HOA funds." Karen's face drained of color. Ah! There it was, the moment she realized the noose was tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, gripping her clipboard like a lifeline. "Really?" I finally spoke up. "Because I do." I stood, taking my time walking to the front. Then, I pulled out copies of financial records showing thousands of dollars missing, suspicious charges for business expenses that looked a lot like personal shopping sprees. "You used HOA funds for yourself, Karen," I said. "And now? Everyone knows it." The room exploded. Karen's empire wasn't just cracking anymore, it was collapsing. Karen always thought she was untouchable. She built her reign on intimidation, twisting the HOA rules to suit her whims, treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. But today, the queen had lost her crown. The HOA boardroom was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers as the newly appointed treasurer read through Karen's list of financial misdeeds. Every dollar she had funneled into her personal expenses, fancy dinners, weekend spa retreats, first-class plane tickets, all labeled under neighborhood beautification projects. The very same woman who fined people for having unapproved mailbox colors had used HOA funds to remodel her kitchen. I sat back in my chair, arms crossed, watching as the reality of her downfall finally hit her. "I think we all know what has to happen next," Elaine said, standing at the front of the room. "Karen Westfield is officially removed from the HOA board. Effective immediately." Karen shot up from her chair, her face twisted in rage. "This is slander. I have done nothing wrong. You." "Actually," Michael Rodriguez interrupted, holding up a certified letter from the county, "this is an official investigation notice into financial fraud. So, unless you want to argue with the district attorney, I suggest you sit down." Karen's lips parted like she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, she slowly sank back into her chair, defeated. The room erupted into murmurs and a few chuckles. I leaned in slightly, just enough for her to hear me. "You know, Karen, it's funny," I said, voice calm. "You spent years punishing people for the smallest infractions. Now, you're the one facing the consequences." The best part? Her beloved house, the one with the imported Italian fountain she forced the HOA to pay for, was now the most devalued home in the neighborhood because of her own bad decisions. As she walked out of that meeting, shoulders slumped, the same neighbors she once tormented whispered and smirked. Karen had finally been defeated by the very system she used to control others. It started with a for sale sign. Just a simple, white sign staked into Karen Westfield's perfectly manicured front lawn, fluttering in the breeze like a white flag of surrender. But this wasn't just any sale, this was an eviction of poetic justice. Karen tried to act like she was leaving on her own terms, as if she had suddenly decided to downsize to a smaller estate somewhere else. But everyone knew the truth. She was being pushed out, not by force, but by the very community she once ruled with an iron fist. The day after her removal from the HOA board, the calls started. Karen's precious network of socialite friends had vanished overnight. No one was returning her calls. The real estate agent she had relied on for years refused to work with her once the neighborhood learned about her fraudulent dealings. The neighbors, people she had once bullied with ridiculous fines and threats, were now making it their mission to make sure she got exactly what she deserved. One by one, they spoke out. Prospective buyers would arrive to tour the house, only to be met with friendly warnings from the people next door. "Oh, you're thinking of buying this place?" Mrs. Gonzalez would say with a sad shake of her head. "Just so you know, the previous owner had a reputation for causing a lot of problems." "Such a shame about the foundation," Michael Rodriguez would chime in, completely fabricating an issue. Not to mention the plumbing. Oh, it's a nightmare. Even the mailman got in on it. Used to be the worst house on my route, he casually told a couple eyeing the property. People were afraid to check their mail because of all the ridiculous HOA fines she handed out. No one wanted to live in the house of a tyrant. Weeks passed, then months. The price dropped. Then dropped again. By the time Karen found a desperate buyer, she was selling at a massive loss. The final insult. The family who bought it turned the entire front lawn into a playground, something Karen had banned for years. She left town without saying a word. No farewell party. No goodbye. Just the echo of her own destruction. It happened faster than anyone expected. The iron grip of Karen's HOA, which had once ruled the neighborhood with petty fines and endless restrictions, crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. For years, homeowners had been afraid to speak out, afraid of retaliation, afraid of losing the battle. But now, the battle was over, and we had won. The final blow came at an emergency meeting, one Karen hadn't even been around to attend. With the community now fully aware of the fraud, intimidation, and outright corruption she and her cronies had been running, there was only one logical course of action: dismantle the HOA entirely. Elaine Wong, who had spent years fighting for her koi pond, stood up first. "I motion to dissolve the HOA permanently," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I second," said Mr. Jenkins, the elderly neighbor Karen had fined for having the wrong shade of blue on his shutters. The vote wasn't even close. An overwhelming majority agreed, Karen's HOA was dead. The rules, the fees, the threats, the ridiculous demands, all of it gone in an instant. People cheered, clapped, even hugged, neighbors who had barely spoken to one another before now celebrating together like old friends. The tension that had loomed over the neighborhood for years vanished overnight. That weekend, something magical happened: a bonfire. Neighbors gathered in my backyard, bringing stacks of old violation notices, complaint letters, and ridiculous fine statements. One by one, they tossed them into the flames, watching as the last remnants of Karen's reign turned to ash. I stood there, watching, feeling something I hadn't felt since the day I moved in: peace. No more petty wars over mailbox colors. No more threats over grass height. No more fear of stepping an inch out of line. As the fire crackled, Elaine turned to me, grinning. "You did it, you know. You took her down." I just laughed, shaking my head. "No," I said. "We did. The HOA was gone. The neighborhood was free. And we had taken back what was ours." With Karen and her minions gone, something strange started happening. Life in the neighborhood actually became enjoyable. The tension that had once gripped every homeowner like a vice was gone. People walked their dogs without worrying about getting fined for using the wrong leash. Kids rode their bikes without their parents constantly checking for HOA patrols. It felt like we had stepped out of a dictatorship and into something resembling an actual community. For the first time in years, people started talking to one another. Not in whispers about who would be the next victim of an HOA fine, but in genuine conversations. Michael Rodriguez, who had spent months battling Karen over a non-compliant flower bed, now led a group of neighbors in planting a community garden where the HOA office used to be. It was poetic. The very space Karen had used to control us was now being turned into something that actually benefited everyone. One afternoon, I saw Mrs. Thompson's kids playing outside with their friends, laughing without a care in the world. I realized how much the stress of living under Karen's rule had affected even the children. Her ridiculous rules had turned our own homes into places of fear, places where people tiptoed around the ever-changing violations, in constant paranoia. Now, they could finally breathe. We all could. But perhaps the most satisfying part of all: watching Karen's old house sit vacant, unsold, for months. No one wanted to buy the home of the tyrant who had ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. The property values she had fought so hard to protect were now sinking, thanks to her own legacy of cruelty and corruption. The irony was almost too perfect. As I sat on my front porch, watching neighbors repaint their homes whatever colors they pleased, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: peace. This wasn't just about getting rid of Karen. This was about taking back our lives. And looking around at my neighbors, finally free from the weight of her oppression, I knew we had won. The neighborhood had been through hell, but in the end, we didn't just survive, we rebuilt stronger than ever. The absence of the HOA's oppressive grip was like stepping into fresh air after years of suffocating under Karen's iron rule. For the first time, we were free. Without the HOA breathing down our necks, people banded together like never before. Michael Rodriguez's community garden flourished in what used to be the HOA's office lot, a symbol of what we had reclaimed. Families who once kept their heads down now worked side by side, planting vegetables, laying out picnic tables, even building a small playground for the kids. It wasn't just a victory, it was a transformation. One afternoon, I stood back and watched as neighbors, people who had once been too afraid to wave at each other for fear of drawing Karen's attention, laughed, shared meals, and talked like lifelong friends. We weren't just homeowners anymore. We were a community. Then came the final act of poetic justice. With a unanimous vote, we officially dissolved the HOA. The last remnants of Karen's reign vanished into history. Her house. Still empty, still unsold, still cursed with the memory of her tyranny. That night, as I sat by my fire pit, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends, I realized something profound: we had done more than take back our neighborhood. We had built something better. A place where people looked out for each other, where kids played freely, where no one lived in fear of a petty tyrant's wrath. We had won, not just by defeating Karen but by proving that together, we were stronger than any HOA rule could ever be.